All right, so we started last week with a series called Plot Twist. And what it's really all about is when life just brings you unexpected things. Unexpected things happen in your life. Things that you're like, where in the world did this come from? Things out of left field. But today we're going to be talking about people that we've looked up to. And when I was a kid, this is going to show my age to some of you, but when I was a kid, one of my heroes was this guy. You might remember this, the Incredible Hulk. That's from the 1970s. That TV show. I used to dress up. I would go around and growl at everybody and I love that show. And so here's another picture. It's me at Christmas with my Incredible Hulk action figure sitting there, all smiles and everything. And just to show you how big of a nerd I was about this show. There was one time that you could write in, back in the days of snail mail, you could write in and you could request a picture. And I still have this picture, and I've got it blown up here, of the guy who played David Bruce Banner. And I've had this, I don't know how many years, since I was probably like 5 or something like that. That's how big of a nerd I was about this show, that I still have that picture of him and that I requested that. So, back then, these guys, right, they seemed larger than life. You probably had some heroes, right? They were strong and they always won. They always knew what to do. And as a kid, you just assumed, right, that your heroes, that they were invincible. When you're a child, even your parents seemed to know everything until you became a teenager. Right? But they seem to know everything, and then, you become a teenager and you miraculously know everything somehow. Or maybe you had that coach. Maybe there was that coach in high school that you really looked up to, seemed to have all the right answers. Or maybe it was a favorite teacher, had it all together. And really, the older we get, the names change, but something inside us really doesn't change about this. We still look for people to admire. There's people in our lives that we look up to. Whether it's a leader or a mentor, a boss, maybe it's a really good friend, maybe it's your spouse. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. God designed us for relationships. He places people in our lives to encourage us, to teach us, to challenge us, to walk beside us, right? People are gifts from God. But somewhere along the way, admiration quietly becomes an expectation. And then we start to place our hope in people. And we never actually say it out loud, but somewhere deep inside, we begin thinking things like, man, if they stay faithful, if they never leave, if they don't make that mistake, or if my kids turn out okay, then everything will be fine. And then something happens. They disappoint us. Sometimes it's something small, right? Maybe it's just a misunderstanding, a broken promise, or words spoken in anger. But sometimes those things are devastating. Maybe a pastor that you looked up to, not even maybe local, but somebody you watch on TV. Maybe they had an affair. Or maybe the church that you loved at one time becomes a place where you were wounded. Maybe a spouse walks away. Maybe a friend betrays your confidence. Maybe it was your parent, or maybe you had an aunt or uncle that you admired who isn't who you thought they were. And I've come to realize something that is both incredibly simple, but is also incredibly freeing, and it is this. People are wonderful gifts, but make terrible gods. They make terrible gods. We were never meant to place the full weight of our hope on another human being. Because no human being, not even the very best one that you can think of, you probably can think of somebody right now, right? Billy Graham. whoever it is. No human being can carry that weight. And one of the reasons disappointment, it cuts so deeply, is because we're not just grieving what happened. We're grieving the future that we imagined. Right? We're grieving that marriage that we thought we would have. We're grieving the friendship that we thought would last forever. We were grieving the church that we thought would always feel like home. The leader that we believed would never fail. The child whose future we had already written in our minds and in our hearts. We're grieving the story we thought was going to be written. And that is exactly where we're going to see Samuel this morning. He is not in the middle of victory, but he's in the middle of grief. So let's open our Bibles. We are going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 16. 1 Samuel chapter 16. As you're finding that here, I just want to welcome anyone who's watching online. It's good to have you, even if you cannot be in the building with us this morning. But we're going to be in the first verse. Let's read this. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long are you going to mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem because I have selected a king from his sons." Now, if you haven't really grown up in church or you haven't spent much time in the Old Testament, the first thing you need to know that the horn they're not talking about a trumpet or anything. It's like a hollowed out horn of an animal. So that's how he's able to have that oil in there. But one of the questions you probably have if you don't know this story well is, who is Saul? And maybe your other question is, why is Samuel mourning? So to answer that, we need to rewind this story for just a moment. So for years, Samuel, he had been Israel's prophet. He had been their judge, their spiritual leader. And then the people, they came to him with a request. They're like, we want a king. Right? We want to be like all the other nations. And God warned them, though, that a human king would eventually disappoint them. But man, they insisted, right? So God gave them Saul. And at first, Saul looked like the perfect choice. He has everything that people thought that a king should be. The Bible says that he stood head and shoulders above everyone else in Israel. He was tall, he was strong, he was charismatic. Right? If Hollywood today were to make a movie about Saul, they would probably cast this guy. Right? Y'all know who that is? Who's that? Chris Hemsworth, of course, right? They would probably cast him. Everyone looked at Saul and thought, man, that is our king. And Samuel believed it too, right? He anointed him. He prayed for him. He watched God use him to unite the nation. But what happens? Success slowly became pride. And then pride became disobedience. Eventually, God gave Saul a clear command that he refused to obey. So when Samuel confronted him, Saul, what did he do? He does what a lot of us do. He made excuses instead of humbling himself. And Samuel replied this. He says, "To obey is better than sacrifice." And then Samuel told Saul, "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel." You see, Saul's greatest problem was not that he sinned. Now, that was a problem. But Saul's problem is that when he was confronted about his sin, what did he do? He defended himself instead of humbling himself. His disobedience, it revealed a heart that had stopped submitting to God's authority. So God, what did he do? He removed him from the throne. And now here's the part of the story that often gets overlooked. Samuel, he's not angry. He's heartbroken. The man he had believed in had fallen. And that's why chapter 16, it opens with God asking, "How long are you going to mourn for Saul?" And can I just say something real quick? Most of us don't know what to do with grief that does not involve a funeral. Right? When someone dies, what do? People bring casseroles. They send flowers. They attend the visitation. But what do you do when the person is still alive, but everything between you has changed? When the relationship isn't what it used to be, or when that trust is broken, when the future you imagine quietly slips away, there isn't a funeral, but there is still grief. Right? Hallmark doesn't make cards for that. And maybe that's why Samuel's story here, it feels so close to home. Think about it. Have you ever mourned someone, not because they passed away, but because something precious was lost? Or maybe the person you're grieving, maybe that person is the one that you see in the mirror every morning. And that's one of the deepest kinds of grief there is, really. Grieving what could have been. And if that is your story, we're going to spend more time on that next week. But for today, Samuel isn't simply mourning Saul's failure. He's mourning the king Saul could have become. He's mourning the future he thought Israel was going to have. He's grieving not only what was, but what might have been. And before God tells Samuel where to go next, he speaks to the grief that is keeping him where he is. So take a look again at verse 1 here. He says, "The Lord said to Samuel, 'How long are you going to mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel?'" I want you to notice something about God's question here. He doesn't ask Samuel, "Why are you mourning?" He asks him, "How long are you going to mourn?" And there's a difference. God isn't criticizing Samuel for grieving. He's not just saying, just get over it. The Bible never treats grief that way. Right? What does it say? Jesus wept. Grief is not a sign that your faith is weak. Sometimes it is a sign that your love and your care was real. Samuel isn't grieving because he lacked faith. Samuel, he is grieving because he genuinely loved and cared about Saul and about his people. And I think that's important for some of us to hear. Some of you have wondered if God is disappointed in your tears and in your grief. And maybe you've heard someone say, "Man, you just need more faith, right? Then you'll get over it." But that's not what God says. God doesn't rebuke Samuel for grieving. He just simply asks him, "How long? How long?" Have you ever had someone in your life ask you a question, ask you this, how long have you been carrying this? And it's not because they're being impatient, but because they don't want you to keep living under the weight. And that's what God is doing here. He's not minimizing Samuel's grief. He is reminding Samuel that grief is not meant to become a permanent home. Because we all walk through seasons of grief, but grief was never meant to become our identity. It was never meant to define the rest of our lives. At some point, grief can stop being something we experience and start becoming the way we experience everything else. And then slowly, without realizing it, that grief has become the lens through which you see everything in your life. So notice what God does next. God gives Samuel a new assignment. So before God changes Samuel's circumstances, what does he do? He changes Samuel's direction. He says, "Fill your horn with oil." Right? What is he saying with that? He said, "Look, Samuel, you're still my prophet. You are still my servant, and I am not finished with you. I'm not finished with your life." And then he says this powerful word. He says, "Go." Go. Because grief has a way of convincing us that life is over. That nothing good could possibly come after this. That this disappointment gets the final chapter. But God says, "Go." In other words, listen, Samuel, it's not over. Saul's chapter, it might be finished, but mine is not. Can you imagine? Imagine what Samuel must have been thinking. He's probably thinking, go where? Right? Go do what? Because he doesn't know yet. He doesn't know how this plays out. He only knows that God is calling him to take that next step. And that's how God often works in our lives, right? We want him to show us the entire plan. I don't know how many times in my life, I was like, God, if you could just map it out for me, that would be great. But God usually only shows us light for that next step. And so here's the encouragement I want you to take with you today, and is this: just because you cannot see what God is doing does not mean God isn't doing something. Just because you can't see what God is doing doesn't mean God isn't doing something. God has already prepared what's next. Samuel didn't know it, but David was already waiting in Bethlehem. God was already at work before Samuel ever arrived. And maybe that's exactly where some of you are today, right? You cannot see what God is doing. All you can see in the moment is what you've lost. But God knows what he has prepared for you. He sees the chapter that you have not lived yet. Because our God has never been, listen, God has never been limited by the failures of people. Praise the Lord for that. Right? People fail. The people you look up to, they're just human. But God remains faithful. And that's exactly what Samuel is about to discover. Let's keep reading. Verse 2, Samuel asked, "How can I go? Saul will hear about it and kill me." The Lord answered, "Take a young cow with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Then invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will let you know what you are to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate to you." Samuel did what the Lord directed and went to Bethlehem. I love that these verses are in the Bible, because if I were writing this story, I would probably leave out verse 2. When God says go, and what does Samuel immediately do? He says, "How can I go?" Right? Saul will kill me. Because doesn't that make Samuel seem a little less courageous? But that's why the Bible is so relatable, right? It doesn't sanitize the people that we look to as heroes of the Bible. Samuel is one of the greatest prophets in Israel's history. Yet here he is, afraid. And honestly, right, who can blame him? Saul has become increasingly unstable. He knows Samuel has rejected him. And if Saul hears that Samuel is on his way to anoint another king, Samuel has every reason to believe that his life is in danger. But notice what God doesn't say. He doesn't say, "Samuel, just stop being afraid." He doesn't rebuke him. Instead, God gives him what he needs for that next step. He gives him instructions. He gives him a plan. He gives him enough light for today's obedience. And this is your next point. Listen, faith is not knowing everything that's ahead. Faith is trusting the one who does. Faith is trusting God and knowing that God knows what's ahead, that he's already written it out for you. And then I love what verse 4 says. It says, Samuel did what the Lord directed. He has questions. He has fears. He is still grieving. But he obeys anyway. Sometimes we picture obedience as looking confident. But the Bible often shows obedience as just looking faithful. Samuel doesn't have all the answers. He simply takes the next step that God gave him. What if God is simply asking you to do the same, to take that next faithful step, to make that difficult phone call or text, right? To forgive that person, to have that difficult conversation. Or maybe if you've been church hurt, maybe it's to serve again. Maybe it's to trust again. To open your heart again. Not because all the questions have been answered, but because God has spoken. And so here's something I don't want us to miss. Samuel is able to move forward, not because his grief is gone, but because God has gone ahead of him. God already knows where he is sending Samuel. He already knows how the story ends, even though Samuel doesn't. Which means, listen, that means this story is not about Samuel figuring everything out. It's about Samuel trusting the God who already has. And that's why I don't think this passage is telling us that we just move on. I think this passage is telling us to move forward. There's a difference. Because God is already ahead of us. And while we're grieving yesterday, God has already prepared tomorrow. So let's keep reading. Verse 6. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and said, "Certainly the Lord's anointed one is here before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or his stature, because I have rejected him. Humans do not see what the Lord sees, for humans see what is visible, but the Lord sees the heart." Skip to verse 10. After Jesse presented 7 of his sons to him, Samuel told Jesse, "The Lord hasn't chosen any of these." Samuel asked him, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," he answered, "but right now he's tending the sheep." Samuel told Jesse, "Send for him. We won't sit down to eat until he gets here." So Jesse sent for him. He had beautiful eyes and a healthy, handsome appearance. And then the Lord said, "Anoint him, for he is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on David from that day forward. And then Samuel set out and went to Ramah. So isn't this amazing? Samuel, what does he do? He walks into Jesse's house, and then he sees the first one, right? He sees Eliab. And he immediately thinks, oh man, this has to be him. Why? It's because he looks like a king, right? He's probably impressive and strong and confident. And doesn't that sound familiar? Because it should. Because that's exactly how Saul's story began. Years earlier, Israel looked at Saul and thought, man, now this, right, this is what a king should look like. And now Samuel is doing the exact same thing. After everything he's been through, after all the disappointment, after all the grief, he is still tempted to judge by outward appearances. And that is so true of us. We like to think that disappointment automatically makes us wiser. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we simply repeat the same patterns with different people. We assume, man, well, this time is going to be different because we're still looking at the same things we've looked at before. And that's why I think verse 7 is one of the most important verses in this chapter. Listen again to what God says. Verse 7, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or his stature, because I have rejected him. Humans do not see what the Lord sees. For humans see what is visible, but the Lord sees the heart." So notice something here. God isn't just choosing a king. There's something a little deeper going on. God is teaching Samuel how to see again. You see, Samuel has spent a lot of time looking backward, and now God is helping him look differently, to look forward. The issue isn't simply that Eliab isn't God's choice. The issue is that Samuel is still using the wrong measuring stick. And that's one of the things that disappointment can do. It can leave us believing the problem is just simply the person, without realizing that God may be trying to change something much deeper and trying to change the way we see things, our perspective. Because people can look impressive, but still have a heart far from God. And then someone can look completely ordinary and become God's chosen instrument. And that's exactly what happens next, right? One by one, Jesse brings the sons before Samuel, one after another. Each time, God's like, nope, not him. Can you imagine how confusing that must have been in the moment? Finally, Samuel asked, are these all the sons you have? And Jesse said, well, they're still the youngest. He's out there in the field somewhere. In other words, right, he's just not that important. Not important enough to invite to something like this. Right? He's just the shepherd. And the one everyone else overlooked was the one God had already chosen. Think about that. Before Samuel ever arrived in Bethlehem, God had already chosen David. Before Jesse ever considered calling for him, God had already set his affection on him. Before anyone else saw anything special about him, God saw the heart. And that's how God often works, right? The world celebrates who is impressive. God delights in who is faithful. So Samuel, he anoints David, the shepherd boy, the giant killer, right? The person you've heard about. And it's tempting to breathe a sigh of relief. He probably was, he was probably, oh great, this is great. Finally here's the king who won't disappoint us. And for a while it does look that way, right? David, he becomes one of Israel's greatest kings. He unites the nation. He defeats Israel's enemies. God, he makes incredible promises through him. But if you know anything about the story, if you keep reading, David disappoints us too. And it's not because he wasn't a great king, because he was. But it's because he was still a sinner, right? He was still human. He was still another reminder that no human being can carry the weight of our hope. So what do we do with this? How do we live in a world where people disappoint us? Or without becoming cynical? Because let's be honest, there are two ditches that we can fall into. One being naive, becoming naive. We convince ourselves that people would never hurt us, that this leader, he will never fall, that our marriage will never struggle, that this friend will never betray us, that our kids are just going to be perfect and want to come home after their first year of college, right? But when they do, our whole world comes crashing down. But then there's the ditch on the other side, and it's cynicism. It's deciding that because one person hurt us, that everyone will hurt us. It's believing that every church is the same. It's believing that every pastor is the same. It's believing that every relationship will eventually end in disappointment. And if we are not careful, we begin protecting ourselves by refusing to hope. And neither one of these is where God has called us to live. So what does it look like to live in that healthy middle ground? I think it comes down to three things. The first is this: love people without expecting them to be Jesus. They can't be Jesus. Can I share with you something that I've learned over the years? After more than 20 years of ministry, and I've come to expect that people, including me, are going to disappoint one another. Now, I don't mean that in a negative way. All right? I don't wake up every morning, turn off my alarm and say, I wonder who's going to let me down today, right? That's not what I'm saying. What I mean is this. I've learned that every one of us is still being transformed by God's grace. Every one of us still struggles with sin. Every one of us still has blind spots. Every one of us still says things that, oh man, I wish I could just take that back. Every one of us still falls. Knowing that has actually helped me love people better, because I'm no longer asking them to be something that they were never meant to be. Now, does that mean that disappointment never hurts? No. No, there have been people I've admired, that I have looked up to, people I've learned from, mentors of mine, people I respected, who have said things to me, who have done things, or failed to do things. Man, it just broke my heart. It just really hurt. And if you've lived very long, or you don't have to live long at all, to know that you probably have names that come to mind this morning. But here's what I've learned. Realistic expectations don't destroy relationships. Unrealistic expectations do. The Bible never tells us to expect perfection from sinners. It tells us to extend grace to sinners. The second thing is this. Don't let one person's failure define everyone else. The temptation is that after we get hurt, the temptation is to overcorrect, right? To build walls and to stop trusting or to stop serving, to stop believing the best of people and to become cynical. I've seen it happen, right? Someone experiences one in the healthy church and decides, well, that's it, all churches are the same. Or one pastor falls and suddenly every pastor is suspect. One friendship, it ends badly and they never let anyone get close again. Or the marriage falls apart and they conclude that love just isn't worth the risk. Listen, don't let one person's failure teach you lessons that God never intended. Cynicism doesn't actually protect your heart. It does not protect your heart. It just hardens your heart. And that is not where Jesus calls us to live. The third thing is this. Anchor your deepest hope where it belongs. Remember what we've been saying this morning. Remember what we said earlier, that people are wonderful gifts, but they make terrible gods. Now hear this. I'm not saying that we should stop trusting people, right? Healthy relationships, they do require trust. What I'm saying is that no person was ever meant to carry the weight of your ultimate hope. That only Jesus can do that. And that the more I expect another person to be everything I need, the more likely that I am to be crushed when they can't. Right? I love my wife, but she is not my Savior. I love my children, but they are not my hope. I love this church, but this church is not my foundation. Because every person, every relationship, every leader will eventually remind me that they are human. Biblical maturity is not learning to expect less from people. It's learning to expect more from God. So that raises an important question. Where do we find someone who will not disappoint us? Where do we find a king worthy of that kind of hope? And that's exactly where the story has been leading all along. Samuel, he was looking for a king. Israel was looking for a king. But God wasn't simply replacing one flawed king with another. What was he doing? He was pointing forward. Forward to the king that they and that we really need. And that's why the Bible doesn't end with David. It keeps pointing us forward. It keeps forward to another son of David, to the greatest king, forward to Jesus. The one, he looked ordinary to many people, but unlike Saul, he never disobeyed his father. Unlike David, he never abused his power. Unlike every pastor, parent, aunt, uncle, spouse, friend, hero, Jesus never failed and will not fail. Some of you this morning have been mourning your own personal Saul, someone in your life, a relationship or a leader, someone that you looked up to. Or you're mourning a version of your life that you thought that you were going to have. And your grief is real. God is not minimizing that. But maybe today, God is asking you the same question that he asked Samuel. How long? Not because he doesn't care, but because he knows what the next chapter is. Listen, don't stay where disappointment left you. You lift your eyes to the one and only true King, who is Jesus. You trust him and you follow him. And then fill your horn, right? There's still ministry to do. There is still people to love. There's still children to raise, prayers to pray. There's still songs to sing. There's still neighbors that need to hear the gospel. And there are still chapters that God has written for your life. So don't stay mourning what's behind you when God has already prepared what is next. So fill your horn and go. Let's all stand.